Love is one of the greatest themes of Christmas. I think everyone would agree with that, or at least most of us would. Hallmark channels make a big deal out of different kinds of love, don't they? Especially around Christmas. Now, their Christmas movies start in July and continue through the rest of the year, but their movies really capitalize on the whole theme of love in several different ways. Some of the ways that they do it, it's usually guy meets girl or girl meets guy, and they work through some difficulties, and then they finally make it to the end and fall in love, and they kiss and whatever, and you're led to believe they live happily ever after. Now, some of the conflicting themes, though, that the couple may deal with is either past broken relationships or maybe materialism, that somebody is an upwardly mobile kind of a person, and they're working up the corporate ladder and don't have time for Christmas, and they work through that and find their Christmas spirit. Or maybe there is a case where they've lost a loved one around Christmas time and it's hard for them. And they work through those different challenges. But all of those realities, including materialism and broken relationships, are the themes that are present in A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. Part of the difficulty Ebenezer Scrooge is dealing with is broken relationships that result in his throwing himself into his work. Now, in midlife or later, it just depends on which. By the way, there is a new Christmas Carol movie coming out and going to be showing here. I don't know exactly when, but I noticed that in some of the advertisements on TV. But part of the difficulty he has is dealing with those broken relationships and throwing himself into his work. Now, in midlife or later, Scrooge finds himself married to his job. But beneath the hard shell of this tightwad is a man who is able to identify heartfelt gratitude and the faith of a child. When the ghost of Christmas Present takes Ebenezer to the Cratchit home, it's interesting to hear Scrooge slip up a bit, isn't it? And a couple of different times, showing some tenderness of heart, especially toward Tiny Tim. Now, it's also interesting to hear Bob Cratchit relay some of Tim's thinking when Tiny Tim said that he wished that people could see him and be reminded of the one who healed the sick and the lame. Interesting. Ebenezer is confronted with a kind of wealth to which he had not given much credence in his life before. He saw in Tiny Tim and Tim's father Bob a wealth of spirit, a wealth of love. So in the journey with the ghost of Christmas Present, there are lessons. There is a lesson in spiritual economics. Scrooge gets a lesson in that spiritual economics, and he sees clearly that gold and silver are not the indices of true value. People are the real measure of true value, those relationships. And the ghost reminds Scrooge of an incident that he had when he, earlier when he had encountered Tiny Tim on the roadway. We haven't seen that, but you can think of this and remember that maybe from the times that you've seen it. And Ebenezer then was also asked by a gentleman or a couple of gentlemen to make a donation for the poor. And Scrooge says, among other things, are there no prisons? And the union workhouses, are they still in operation? Those who are badly off must go there. And then one of the gentlemen said to Scrooge, many can't go there, and many would rather die. To which Scrooge replied, if they would rather die, they had better do it and decrease the surplus population. Wow. That's cold, isn't it? That is cold. Scrooge has yet to understand that the riches of love far surpass the accumulation of wealth and money. He is yet to learn that generosity brings a joy with which dollars cannot compare. And it is a part of spiritual economics. The book of Proverbs gives some of those lessons on spiritual economics. In Proverbs chapter 17, verse 1 are these words: better a dry crust with peace and quiet than a full house of feasting with strife. Makes sense, doesn't it? Here's another one from Proverbs 15:6. Better a little with the fear of the Lord than great wealth with turmoil. Another one from Proverbs 16, chapter 16, verse 8. Better a little with righteousness than much gain with injustice. And the last one I'll highlight is from Proverbs chapter 11, verse 24. Some give freely, yet grow all the richer. Others withhold what is due and only suffer want. Spiritual economics. God's economic works different than the world's economic. So there is a value of relationships, isn't there? A value of relationships is at the heart of the birth of Jesus. And thinking about some of the different events that happened with Mary and Joseph that we read about earlier demonstrate the value of relationships and the treasure of love that they had for each other and for the Lord. First, let's consider Joseph. I mean, we think a lot of Mary, and we also think of Joseph because of that account in Matthew, but Joseph chose love for Mary and for God when he took that chance, when he obeyed what the angel had told him to do and taking Mary as his wife. He stood with Mary and accepted the child that God was bringing into the world through her. He was to care for the son as his own, indeed his firstborn, and therefore the most favored child in some ways. He was to endure the embarrassment, possible embarrassment, the questions and the uncertainties of these special circumstances. But Joseph valued relationship over embarrassment. He endured the embarrassment. He valued relationship by making a commitment to God, to Mary, and to the child, Jesus, when he took Mary as his wife. And Mary, she valued relationships as well, when she made a commitment to God, to Joseph, and to Jesus by saying yes to God's call through the angel's message to her to bear this child. May it be to me as you have said. And Mary and Elizabeth valued relationships when they got together for a great time of celebration, both expecting, and now the babe in Mary's or in Elizabeth's womb leaped for joy, and they celebrated together. Elizabeth and Zachariah valued relationships, even though they were childless in their marriage and late in life. They received the promise, but they loved one another and valued those relationships. And God valued relationships. He valued relationships with us so much that he gave his one and only Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish but have everlasting life. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. So what price can we put on this value of a relationship with God, the creator of heaven and earth, and with his Son, Jesus Christ? How can we put a value on that? I don't think we can, but we can acknowledge what great value it is. What might be a worthwhile price to pay for such a relationship with God and his Son? What would you give for God's voice to be familiar and his care and provisions to be realized in your own life? I heard someone, I read where someone had written about if he had 1,000 lives to give, he would give them all for the gospel. It was a preacher speaking to another young pastor who was just getting ready to start going into the pastorate. And he encouraged him by saying, if I had 1,000 lives to live, I would give them all for the gospel. That's a great prize. And I know of no greater riches than the presence and blessing of God. Scrooge's wealth cannot compare with that bounty, can it? All the wealth in the world Now, sometimes we might think we would like to give it a try, but all the wealth in the world does not compare to the joy that Jesus gives, to the love that we experience in those relationships. Scrooge's wealth cannot compare. Where are your riches? What do you value most? And our actions will reveal our priorities and what we value at Christmas and throughout the year. It is part of storing up treasures in heaven that will last. One of the most striking things about the Cratchit family, I believe, is even though they were a family of meager means, they cared for one another in a powerful way. They loved one another. Yes, they were delighted in the provisions that they had for that special meal, but they truly valued relationships that they had on their ongoing care, and they showed that by that care for one another. Two of the children lifting up Tim and taking him into the other room is a touching sight, even for Scrooge. And he said, look how they support him. Now, he couldn't admit to his tenderness at that moment when the angel said, what? Nothing. Nothing. They spoke with respect to one another. The children did. And to their parents. And the parents to the children. They helped with tasks around the house. They were all doing that. And you could see that when you see the whole movie. And Bob's prayer seemed to sum up the entire sentiment of that day for them. I want to read his prayer again. Listen to this prayer. Lord, we thank you for the bounty you have placed before us. We thank you for this day of love and joy. We thank you for allowing us to be together, to share with each other and with you the fullness of our hearts on this special day. Amen. Even Ebenezer Scrooge was moved to say amen to that prayer. I think Charles Dickens wrote a good prayer highlighting family relationships in A Christmas Carol. He also highlighted that they shared these fullness of relationships not only with each other, but with God. And in the movie, the focus of togetherness was so highlighted by Bob and his wife together earlier. He ended their conversation with, we're all here. And that's what's important. We're all here. That's what's important. And they treasured in their heart, what they treasured in their heart were the relationships they had with each other and with loved ones. It was revealed in their words and actions. They were bound together in love, and that bond gave them freedom to express love to one another openly and frequently. Listen to some of what the letters have to say in some of Paul's letters about the value of love. From 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verse 4. Let all that you do be done in love. And in Colossians 3:14. And above all these, put on love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony. And then who can forget 1 Corinthians 13? So faith, hope, and love abide, these three. But the greatest of these is love. The treasure that lasts involve loving relationships and that we invest in during our lives. And we build spiritual wealth as we invest in those relationships throughout our lives. We store up treasure that lasts by giving ourselves to others. True riches are not found in the accumulation of wealth, but in the extravagant investment of love. I like that statement. True riches are not found in the accumulation of wealth, but in the extravagant investment of love. I read a story, and it's the story of some decades past, but and I'm not sure about the real circumstances of it, whether it's just something that somebody made up or whether it's a real encounter. It sounds like it was a real encounter, but I was unable to find its original source. But it was about a man on Christmas Eve who had received a car from his brother as a present. And there was a little boy that when he came out of the office on Christmas Eve ready to go home, the man did, the little boy was standing around admiring the car. And as the man came toward the car, the little boy asked, "Mister, is this your car?" And he said, "Yes. My brother gave it to me at Christmas, for Christmas." The little boy said, "You mean your brother gave it to you and it didn't cost you nothing?" Then he nodded his head. And the little boy said, "Boy, I wish." And he thought he could hear it coming. You know, he wished he had a brother like that who could give him something like that. But the little boy went on and said, "I wish I could be a brother like that." Now that still has a couple of different meanings, can't it? That I'd be rich enough that I could give a car away. But there was something different in the way he said it that the man thought, there's something more of what he's saying. And so he said, "Would you like to take a ride in this car?" Now obviously this is not modern day, is it? And if there are any children still remaining in the congregation, do not get into a car with somebody who has a shiny car who offers you a ride. But he did. He took him for a small ride, and as they were riding, the boy said, "Mister, could you just drop me by my home?" And he gave him directions to get there, and he said, "It's the one right up there with 2 steps." And so he pulled up in front, and he said, Can I go inside and let my brother see this car?" So he went inside, and they took a minute or two, but a little bit he came back out, and he was carrying his small brother who couldn't walk because of polio. And the boy sat down on the bottom step with his brother beside him, leaning up against him, and he pointed at the car and he said, "There she is, buddy, just like I told you upstairs. Ain't she beautiful? That man's brother gave it to him for Christmas and it didn't cost him nothing. You know what, buddy? Someday I'm going to give you one just like it. Then you can see all the Christmas things in the store windows that I've been telling you about." Well, you know what happened next, don't you? Mom was standing at the door at this time, and the man said, "Boys, do you think your mom would let us take a little ride and see some of those windows now?" And they jumped into the car and had a great Christmas ride, holiday ride. Let me ask you a question. Who do you think got the bigger blessing? Now, we don't know how much that an experience like that can impact somebody's life. Maybe it really transformed something in both of those children and the mother. But I can't help but think that the man with the car was the one who was blessed. And if we have forgotten or neglected the truth about that extravagant love for one another, now is the time to recover. Along with breaking the chains forged in life, we can learn to value relationships, especially at Christmas. Like the Cratchits, we can make the commitment to value and care for those whom God brings into our lives, into our sphere of influence. So we need to value and care for those whom God has placed in our lives. So let's stop just for a few moments here and just take a brief inventory of our relationship. Think about your relationship. Think about your family members. How are your relationships with them? What do you discover about where you have invested? Have you invested in them emotionally? Have you invested in them with your time? Have you invested in them by prayer? Where have you neglected to invest? Maybe you can take some more time later on and think about those kinds of questions. Are there any significant debt that you owe to others as you think about those relationships? Maybe somebody has invested in your life in a powerful way, and you want to just let them know that you appreciate that. Are there any significant debt that you owe, or maybe are there any significant debts that you feel someone owes to you? What kind of step can you take in investing in rebuilding those relationships? Now, I know that there are many steps that we can take to value our loved ones, but I want to suggest a few this morning. One is maybe take a family picture, portrait of some kind, or maybe just a picture that you even have on your phone, and pray over it. It can be maybe even a family picture from when you were younger. And just pray over it. Give thanks for the positive things that have happened over the years. Offer God the sadness and pain and disappointment and regret that may have come your way. Then ask God to help you make this the richest Christmas ever in those relationships with love. And there are some other kinds of things in those Advent calendars that I mentioned earlier in the service. Again, starting with week 3 this time, consider some of the suggestions in that Advent calendar for devotions for December. Like, who is someone special who you could celebrate by spending time with them this season? Maybe there's a friend that you had for a good part of your life, and you've just gotten out of touch over the years. Maybe today or this Christmas season would be a good time to reestablish that relationship. Or what about someone, who has helped you in the past, and you want to thank them for the way that they've touched your life? Or consider someone maybe that you know of who's living close by you, who maybe hasn't lived in our community or even in our country for a long time, and they need some encouragement. Or maybe who could be your Cratchit family? Somebody that you could help, somebody that's going through a difficult time. By the end of the show, Ebenezer Scrooge found a natural outlet for his Christmas joy in helping Bob Cratchit and his family. And he reached out to them. Children are a central part of Christmas gatherings and Christmas themes. Maybe you could take a child out for a day and spend some time talking to them and just sharing with them and investing in their lives, and encouraging your young friend by explaining the true cause for excitement at Christmas, the presence of Christ. More than giving gifts, we can give the gift that money can't buy, the gift of yourself. After all, that's what God did.